I'm John Chamberlain, a member of the board of the Arkansas Academy of Computing, and today I'm going to interview Paula King Norwood, one of our 2014 inductees to the Academy. Paula, could you tell us the story of how you became involved in computing?
Well, I grew up in Clarksville, Arkansas, and went to Hendrix College and majored in math. I thought I would be a math teacher, but discovered I didn't really like being in front of the classroom because I was shy. And when I went back to school, Dr. Cecil McDermott convinced me to look at going to graduate school. From there, I went to the University of Arkansas Medical Center in Little Rock and got a 2-year degree in biometry, which is a mixture of biostatistics and mathematics uses in science.
Okay.
And from there, I went to Virginia Tech and got a PhD in statistics. As I progressed through school, the technology of doing statistics changed quite a bit. We started out doing everything on mechanical calculators or by hand. And if you're at all familiar with statistics, you know there's a lot of computing, so that was very labor intensive. From there, when I was working on my PhD, we actually got our first electronic calculators. And it was a brain with 4 electronic units attached to it that we had to go to a special room to use. And at that time we also, at the University of Arkansas, we had the CDC 3300 that Jerry went to the university to help install. And I took my first course in Fortran programming there.
Okay.
Then, so at Virginia Tech, we did have access to a computer. It was programming Fortran and with the big punched cards and submitting them at night and getting our results the next morning. So writing and debugging a program was very labor intensive. So mainly we still did our work with calculators, some of the mechanical calculators that were available to us. And if we wanted to go over to the university and use the electronic ones, we could do that. When I finished school, I went to work at a small pharmaceutical company in upstate New York and replaced a statistician who had done all of his calculations with an abacus.
Oh my goodness.
The people whose offices were next door were very grateful that I didn't use an abacus, but I had a small handheld calculator that I convinced them to buy for me at great expense. Mm-hmm. And we, again, had access to a batch computer and did some Fortran programming, but it was so we had to write all our own programs for everything, so we continued to do most of our work with calculators. Then I went to Johnson & Johnson in the small division of orthopharmaceutical as the first statistician there. And at that time, they were doing the data processing on a IBM computer with COBOL, custom programs written for each study in the COBOL programming language. And there's no way to do a statistical analysis, so I was still doing most of my work by hand. Mm-hmm. But at J&J we had a corporate computer center that had a DEC 10 time-sharing computer. Okay. So I took the data from the COBOL machine and loaded it up on the timeshare computer and was doing my work, as Jerry described, you know, very quickly writing and debugging programs. Mm-hmm. After I'd been there about a year and was really struggling my job was basically to help, as a statistician, to work with the physicians to help design our clinical trials, design the data collection, take responsibility for the data when it came in, to organize it, analyze it, and write reports. So very quickly, as the technology changed, I was working on the computer and doing all the work myself. So one day I saw people coming in for job interviews, and they were very well-known statisticians who ran large departments at larger pharmaceutical companies coming in to interview. So I went to my boss after gathering my courage and I said, "Sam, I see that you're interviewing for someone to head up a statistics department here." And he said, "How do you know?" And I said, "Well, statistics is a small field. I know these people that you brought in." And I gave him the names of the people he had already interviewed. And I said, "I really don't think you're going to attract someone with that kind of experience at a larger company to come to ortho. So why don't you give me a chance?" And so he said, well, what would you do if I gave you a chance? And I started to tell him, and he said, no, write it down. So I went home that night and I wrote down all the things that I needed in order to do my job better and more efficiently, because I knew that's what we needed to start a department. And I went in the next morning, and this was before the days of word processing, so this was all written longhand on note paper, and gave it to him, and he read it over. A couple of days later said, I'll give you a shot. So that's how we got started. Hiring scientific programmers who knew Fortran, getting SAS on our computer across the street, and organizing our work for greater efficiency. And as our research division grew, the department grew by hiring more programmers, statisticians, and the nurses and data entry people to handle the data.
So did the nature of the work, the things you were doing, change?
The nature of the work didn't change. We were still designing and analyzing studies, writing reports that went to the FDA for review and approval of new drug applications. What changed, though, as technology changed, we were able to collect and analyze much more data. What this meant in terms of our drug development is we learned more about the patients and about the activity of the drugs in the patients, so that I feel we were able to actually develop safer drugs because we were able to collect and analyze more data. But in about a 10-year period, instead of sending new drug applications that consisted of about 20 volumes of the reports and the data listings and patient summaries, we were sending whole truckloads of paper to the FDA. We'd rent a U-Haul truck and send it down, and they'd back up to a loading platform and unload it. And the FDA reviewers were still reviewing the studies and the results by hand, the same way they always had. And the amount of work had grown tenfold or more. So in 1985, my boss called me into his office and gave me a new assignment, and that was to work on an industry-wide committee for the electronic transmission of data to the FDA. And my first reaction was to laugh. It's like, are you kidding? Change the FDA? They were the most anachronistic group you'd ever seen. Everyone worked very independently. No one told anyone what to do. And I just couldn't imagine changing the way an organization like that worked. But let me back up a little bit. The initiative was started by Erwin Lerner, who was chairman of the board of Hoffman LaRoche.
Okay.
His motivation was Valium went off patent, and Hoffman LaRoche's income suddenly went to less than a tenth of what it had been. At the same time that they had new drugs down at the FDA for review that would have kept their income stream going, but it was taking 7, 8, 10 years to approve a new drug application. Okay. And the slowness was not because they were doing a good job, it was because they were doing an impossible job. So our committee that I was assigned to started meeting with FDA reviewers to find out how they reviewed NDAs. And after about 4 months on the committee, I was asked to chair it, which surprised me because I was one of the most junior members of the committee in terms of experience. But I think this is where my Arkansas background came through. We're all nice. People from Arkansas are taught to be nice and cooperative and worked with a lot of enthusiasm, and that's really what carried the day in terms of chairing that committee. We met with every division of the FDA, and we met with every company that was starting to do pilot electronic submissions. And the job was not to figure out how to submit the data electronically, it was how to figure out how to use a computer to help in the review process, to replace the hand tabulating and individual review that the reviewers were doing by hand. And it was probably one of the most interesting things that I undertook in my whole career. I was chair of the committee for 4 years, and my job was not at all technical. I sat with the committee, and we, after meeting with the reviewing divisions and the people who were doing pilots, identified a list of about 10 major things that needed to be done in order to submit data electronically to the FDA in a way that they could review it. And we set up subcommittees for all of those things to address them. The biggest challenge was a political one of getting people who were submitting the pilot NDAs to share what they were doing publicly. People viewed that, for the most part, as proprietary. And so I had to work with, I think about 6 or 7 different companies were submitting them at the time, work with the management to get them to agree to share what they were doing publicly. So we had our first public meeting that was attended by people from all throughout the industry, standing room only. The commissioner of the FDA, chairman of the board of Hoffman LaRoche, the head of the reviewing part of the FDA were all on the panel that had the opening session, and me. I did not want to do that, but it was very, very successful. We had it jointly shared we sponsored it jointly with the FDA so that it would be open to vendors. All the software companies came. At that time, they had relational databases were in their first version. There were no Boolean query systems that were on the market. People who were doing the pilot submissions were writing their own software for that. So within a year, the software came out commercially that was doing what was needed. We established a committee to set up common coding standards across the industry, and that was one of the most fascinating things to me. We had the technical people, of course, on the committee, and they had access to the internet, which I didn't even know in prior to that even existed, because it was the internet was just mainly between academic institutions, but we were in New Jersey very close to Bell Labs, and so they had access to the Bell Labs part of it, and put a structure on the computer that was almost within 3 months completely filled in by people from all around the industry. It was crowdsourcing. The first time I had ever seen crowdsourcing, it was done on the internet by people throughout the industry who were not being paid for their work.
What year was that?
That was in 1987.
Okay.
Very early. In fact, to prepare for this, I went online to see the history of the internet. How could that have happened in 1987 when there was no World Wide Web?
Right.
And that's how I, really understood what they had accomplished. I was just chairing the committee. It was a political job. From my perspective, it wasn't a technical job that I had. And it was just amazing how quickly they developed it and the companies adopted use of it. Whereas in the past they'd each had their own coding structure, which is like the Tower of Babel. The FDA reviewers had no way of dealing with all those different coding structures. So from there, I, of course, continued to develop the department at Ortho, and we were merged with other research divisions within J&J, and as the department became larger as a result of mergers and internal growth, I stayed the head of statistics and data processing. And it was a wild ride and a wonderful career. Wow. Many times very difficult, because my job was not to develop a department. It was to get the statistical support of the design and analysis of all the studies done, and to get the submissions written and submitted and the review supported. Developing the department was just a means to that end.
And then changing the process at the FDA.
At the same time,
yeah.
That's right. It was all a mix.
It's easy to see how a shy person got into that. Not really. I mean,
Not really. But the whole thing is everyone was shy. I mean, the statisticians and the programmers, the people who were doing this work, were all introverted, shy people. And some communicated with others. I mean, one of our research vice presidents at one time at lunch was joking. He said, the reason Paula is the head of the statistics department is she can talk to the rest of us and some of the others can't. And I said, that was one of the most backhanded compliments I'd ever gotten, but there was a lot of truth to it.
yeah.
You have to work at communicating, but it's an important part of the job.
You've told us a lot about how the computing evolved up from the 70s through the internet era, and you have any observations on looking forward where all of that's going to go?
I don't know if this is looking forward, but one of the initiatives the government undertook in the past few years was to make medical records be put on the computer.
Mm-hmm.
And I was disappointed to see that they rushed so fast to that goal. That one of the things we did with the computer-assisted NDA was to recognize it had to be database-based.
Mm-hmm.
It couldn't be text-based.
Mm-hmm.
We did submit our reports in PDF files, but the rest of it was all data in structured databases that could be analyzed, could be queried, it could be accessed as data. Mm-hmm. What the government, when the government insisted that medical records be computerized, they didn't specify any way. So that what has been done, for the most part, is paper records. Mm. So when your doctor puts your records on the computer, it's paper files that they can access and deal with only the way they dealt with their own charts. Mm. So it's a big missed opportunity. Yeah. You know, it should be possible to do it database so that you could find all the patients in your organization that were taking a certain drug. Mm-hmm. And find out learn more about the side effects that they're experiencing. Now, having said that, some organizations have been doing that for a long time. The Mayo Clinic, for example, has had computerized health records for many years, and they organize theirs as a combination of paper records, mm-hmm. paper images, and data. So a lot of what has been learned about drug interactions comes from databases like that at the Mayo Clinic. An example I can think of off the top of my head is there were 2 diet pills, fen. One was over the counter, and I guess they were both over the counter. Maybe one was prescription. That caused a serious heart problem in young women. And the 2 drugs were not ever studied together. I think they were never intended to be used together. I think they were even marketed by 2 different companies. Mm. But many young women were taking both of them and developed heart valve problems. And the person who discovered that noticed that was at a woman's heart specialist at the Mayo Clinic, noticed that she was seeing far too many young women with heart valve problems, and called the statistics department at Mayo, which is an excellent biostatistics department, and asked them to go into their database to find out what these women had in common, and then publish the paper about the side effect. Okay. Now, so there are some large organizations that have data as their medical records, but most of the doctors around the country are just do not. And I felt it was a missed opportunity. In fact, I had been bold enough to write an email to the president, you know, uh-huh. telling him that, you know, it was a great idea that all the medical records be computerized, but they should take advantage of work that had been done for the FDA to set up medical records in databases. Yeah. And if they were interested in doing that, I'd be happy to, you know, point them in the right direction in terms of people that could help them. And
too bad they didn't take you up
answer.
On it. Yeah.
So.
Well, we've got a little bit of time left, and do you have any words of wisdom for people, young people in particular, looking forward to careers?
The only thing I really learned that probably many people already know is how much can be accomplished if you work together in groups. I mean, our committee at work, my management team worked this way, and the committee that I chaired industry-wide worked this way. We sat in a room together and identified all the things that needed to be done. Mm-hmm. And then we prioritized them and set groups together to address them, and accomplished so much more than I ever would have imagined. Because it was done in an open environment with full access to information, and people all contributing to the solution. And that's, I think, the way we're going to work more and more in the future too. And the computer, the internet, cloud source, you know, cloud storage and all that really, really opens up the possibilities for that.
Paula, it's been good talking to you. You've had an amazing career, and I hope we do more of what you were just suggesting, of the working together on things.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it very much, John.
Thanks.